the early Quakers, again, were really clear. It's in our conscience. That's where we first encounter the light, is in our conscience. My name's David Johnson. I live in northeastern Australia, in the tropics here. I'm a member of Queensland Regional Meeting. That's my monthly meeting. And I found myself a couple of years ago, well, probably more than that, almost 10 years ago now, being encouraged inwardly to read the early Friends literature. I was familiar with many of the quotes which we know are familiar, answering that of God in every person from George Fox. And they're really key statements for Friends. And they're very important. But I also wanted to read more. I felt I was drawn in to read more of these writings and understand where they were coming from. And in particular, they were such amazing, extraordinary people. They changed the culture of around them. They did it in the midst of a civil war and with enduring persecution. So they had a spiritual power and life and forbearance and courage, which is actually quite amazing when you read their stories. So I want to go back and read them. And the second thing in this story is that people often ask us as they come to Quakers, what do Quakers believe? And I've heard that question asked many times in inquirers meetings. And mostly they get a very wide range of answers because modern Quaker spirit and practice is very broad. But the early Friends were quite different. They were very specific, very clear, and they could explain it in very few sentences. They didn't need 10 or 15 minutes to ramble on. And I want to read to you a quote from William Penn. Now, this was published in 1696 in a little article called The Christian Quaker, which was really defending and explaining Quaker spirituality. That which the people called Quakers lay down as a main fundamental in religion is this, that God through Christ hath placed a principle in every person, and there are two things here. Firstly, to inform each of us of our duty and to enable us to do it. Now, as a young Anglican, I understood that God would tell us what to do, but I never heard this bit, and enable us to do it. That that the spiritual life and power comes through us to actually enable us to do what's being asked of us. By duty, of course, is meant what to do and what to refrain from doing. It's God advises us both go this way, but also cautions us, don't do that. And it's very important that both those things, and the early Friends picked this up very clearly. This is their ancient, first, and standing testimony. With this they began, in other words, that's how they started off in the 1640s and 1650s. This they bore through all the persecutions. The general estimate is 15,000 Quakers went to prison and 450 died for their witness. So it was a considerable persecution. They bore this testimony all through that, and as Penn says, and do bear to the world. They still bear this testimony that there's an inward teaching, an inward guide, which will guide us into what is right, caution us against what is wrong, and enable us to follow. And that's a very clear statement. There's no mumbo jumbo about different sorts of things. I found that very helpful when I first read it. And the question then is, so in what way do we actually experience this awareness? Now, for Quakers, the word for understanding that awareness is this inward light. The inward light makes us aware what's going inside us, what's in our inner reality, what are we being asked to do, what are we being asked not to do. And the early Quakers, again, were really clear. It's in our conscience. That's where we first encounter the light, is in our conscience. It's an awareness that shows us very quickly if we've done something wrong, or say we've said something a bit harsh or a bit unkind to somebody. How often do most of us find soon afterwards a little thing rises inside us and says in our conscience, that was a bit harsh, that was a bit quick, you know? And early friends made this jump, you see, that is not just our parents or our teachers talking to us, but this little voice is so immediate and it has such a ring of truth. It's so clear. You can't say, oh, no, because you know inside you this is the ring of truth. And this is the light of God working within us in our conscience. That's where we first find it. Then, of course, as we start paying attention to that, we find this light tends to increase and show us a range of other things about us, about our spiritual path, about what to do and what not to do. See if this speaks to your own experiences. Because there are two aspects to your conscience and how you feel inwardly. Because it's an experience, you see. This is not a doctrine. This is an experience that they wrote about. If you've done something which is out of line spiritually, you will feel a bit chastened or uncomfortable, maybe even a little bit of sort of pain in the heart. But if you've done what you've been asked to do by God, naturally or directly, normally the feeling inwardly is a sort of just a gentle peace or a feeling of being comfortable. Things are going along step by step as they should be. Now, that inner feeling in the heart, am I at peace with God, or have I been out of line and feel chastened and uncomfortable? That is the key experience of the early friends. And they said, pay attention to your conscience. There's a vast difference between this conscience and what we might term our sort of, well, the early friends used the word natural conscience, or our cultural upbringing. Because often what we might be told of as our duty towards our country or towards our community, or the normal way we behave in the capitalist system, might be, for instance, to not be entirely truthful in everything we say, just to sort of get ourselves a little bit of an advantage out of the situation. Some of that's a defense mechanism, but some of it's actually just trying to get the upper edge a little bit. Now, that goes on a lot, but that is a sort of cultural training in a sense, and also arises and sometimes from our own things that need to be healed. Now, sometimes, you know what you do? A lot of people say, oh, yeah, but he deserved it because, or but she did that last time, or something like that. Now, that is simply rationalizing in our own self-defense, something which the light has shown us was wrong. And the early Quakers became gradually sometimes, like all of us, willing to be completely inwardly honest and truthful. That's truth, you see. When the light shows you something, that is truth. Probably the thing to do now is to read a couple of the actual examples of the early writings. I'll start with William Dewsbury. Now, William Dewsbury was a weaver and a shepherd, a man in his late 20s who joined Oliver Cromwell's New Model Army because he thought this was going to bring a more godly pattern of life on earth. But in the army, you know what? He heard a voice that said to him, put up your sword in your scabbard. And Dewsbury heard this. And he left the army. And he later became a Quaker. He met Fox and became a Quaker in about 1653. Let me read this to you. I was moved to declare to souls where their teacher is, the light in their consciences, of which the Lord hath given unto everyone a measure to profit withal, for the exercise of the conscience towards God and men. And waiting in the light for the power of Christ, he would lead them up to the living fountains of water, where their souls would find refreshment in the presence of the Lord, and their bread would be sure, and their water never fail, as the Lord hath made manifest to my soul. He's saying that's an admission that it's manifested to his own soul. He's experienced this, that in following the light to his conscience, he receives a spiritual stability and guidance, and he finds this inward refreshment like a fountain of water, living water that's coming up in him, and he has spiritual food, the heavenly manna, which is sure and comes to him each day. Marvelous, really, isn't it? Now, one other thing about this early Quaker stuff I'd like to emphasise is that Dewsbury was in his early 30s when this happened. Many of the early Quakers were young people. Early Quaker spirituality was a young people spirituality. George Fox was born in 1624. In 1647, he was preaching inspiringly at the age of 23. James Parnell was a minister at 15. Robert Barclay wrote the Apology for the True Christian Divinity in his 20s, first in Latin, and then he translated into English so more people could read it easily. Elizabeth Bathurst was 24 when her book Truth Vindicated was published in 1679. I'll come back to Elizabeth in a minute. Mary Fisher was a servant girl who ended up preaching in the streets. And then in 1655, she was 32 at the time. She went with Anne Austen to Barbados, and then were the first two Quakers to land near Boston in Massachusetts and start preaching the Quaker message. They were immediately thrown into prison, by the way. Anyway, let me read to you. This is from Elizabeth Bathurst. Let me come back to Elizabeth Bathurst. This is a young woman who was read out of her Presbyterian community for daring to oppose the doctrine of predestination. That is, that everybody's sort of predestined to sin or to die or what have you. And she eventually became a Quaker, and she wrote a beautiful letter to some of her firmer friends. So I found something really important, and I want to tell you a little bit about. That one eternal principle, to wit, the light of Christ manifest in the conscience, leads into a heavenly order, according to the diversity of its gifts, whereby man comes not to be at liberty in his own will, but bound again to God, which is the true significance of the word religion. This is a young woman. She experienced this at 22. It wasn't in print till she was 24. It leads into a heavenly order. That's just marvelous. That as people start following this, they come into their lives are ordered by divine will and divine grace, not the chaos and antagonism which is often in the worldly order. According to the diversity of gifts, because all of us have different gifts to bring to make this heavenly ordered community, whereby people are not at liberty in their own wills, but bound again to God, which is the true significance of the word religion. So this word religion, which gets a lot of bad press these days, the key thing is that lig in the middle of it, religion. Now, lig means to bind. It's the same root of the word. If you have a wound, you tie it up on your arm. It's a ligature. If you have a joint, what binds a joint together? A ligament. Lig means so. Religion means to rebind ourselves to God and to each other in a holy community. That's what religion is. It's not a mass of doctrines. It's actually the experience of being bound together into the divine presence in ourselves and to each other. Absolutely wonderful possibility, isn't it, really? Here's another bit from Elizabeth. A principle of divine light and life in Christ Jesus placed in the conscience, which discovers both sin and duty to us. Now, discovers in the 1600s actually meant like uncovers. It reveals inwardly, it uncovers as if some dark veil's been taken off it and you clearly see it inwardly. Discovers or uncovers to us both sin, what we've done wrong, and duty, what we're supposed to do right to us. And not only so, but it reproves the sin, and enables us to perform the other. In other words, enables us to do what is right. Same principle that was in Penn's writing. And this I know, that a measure of the same is placed in the conscience of all mankind, by which they might see the right way, were but their minds turned thereunto. Well, there you go. These are the early Quaker writings. So when I read this all through and meditated on it a bit and started to practice it more in my own life, to be more inwardly attentive, I found myself asking, what if it's that simple? What if it is that simple? That the laws are written on the tablets of our heart, that we can be guided by this, what in the scriptures called the inward anointing. We can be guided by this and taught by this in every moment. From that case, it's available to every person and has always. You don't have to be educated. Do you know what? You don't even have to be able to read or write, as have most people in human history. I mean, why would God have waited until we had advanced education in the 20th century for people to become enlightened? It's available to every person, whether they can read or write. And yet, once you accept it and start to really notice what's going on in your conscience, because it's so wonderful, it's there all the time. And as you start to notice what's happening and not rationalize it, but say, well, actually, what you have to do is you have to welcome it. Do you know what Fox called that? He called it love the light, no matter what it shows you, because that will lead you and heal you